All right, we're going to bring you more details right now on these meetings with our first guest who's with us right now, Jonathan Wachtel, a global affairs analyst and former part of the former US mission to the United States, is with us right now. Jonathan, I'm not sure if I pronounced your last name correctly, so do go forward and correct me. Jonathan, as you do that though, also, good evening. Thank you for joining us. I want to come to you with our first question for today. Jonathan, in the past, historically, when you take a look at what experts have written about the relationship India and the United States share, they said that in the past it was marked with some skepticism, some mistrust on both sides. And at least in New Delhi, there is now the sense that that to some degree has dissipated. Would you agree that that's true for Washington too?
You know, I have to say, that's a very good question. And, you know, I followed the India-U.S. relations for quite some time. And I have to say there's a buzz this time like I've never seen before. And I don't know how much of it comes down to anxiety that the United States has over China, and presumably India has anxiety over China, of trying to forge a future that looks a little bit less grim by having this relationship and this budding, happy relationship grow. There is something going on, certainly, that is different from I just haven't seen this in decades, to be honest.
Okay. All right. Jonathan, I want to double click there on what you touched on right now, which is obviously this question of China. We've seen officials from the United States just a few weeks before this meeting very pointedly say that this meeting is not about China. I'm talking about the NSA's statement. But I do want to understand, how do you look at the Chinese subtext, particularly because as recently as yesterday, we saw American statespeople come forward. We saw them say that, look, it's the end to the spy balloon chapter that we saw play out a few months ago. So it's clear that there is an attempt to rebuild that relationship. That relationship was obviously at a low point, as we just said a few weeks ago. So walk us through how we should place China in the context of all of this.
You know, you just had Secretary Blinken in China, and he made a very supportive statement while in Beijing about how there's no desire of the United States to change the status of Taiwan, which, of course, is something so central to Beijing in terms of their posture in the world and aspirations. And there's this attempt to try to simmer down the tensions between the United States and China. You know, that's understandable and very important in a perilous world. But at the same time, it would be naive to think that the competition between these two great superpowers is not there and present, and the future is you know, not necessarily rosy and needs to be strategically worked out in such a way in which there's no collision between the powers. And certainly we don't want to see a military collision. And Taiwan is a flashpoint, and it's very tense what's going on there. So all this nice talk is an attempt to try to put things in a better direction. But here we have India now coming into play here, into focus, and a sigh of relief, I have to say, in terms of looking at the world, not in a bipolar sense, but in a sense of another great power, a great power that happens to be a democracy that shares many values that the United States has, that it's not an autocracy like China is. It's not a one-party system. It's a country that has had a variety of prime ministers, and though Prime Minister Modi has held sway since 2014, elections happen and there can be changes of government. The same can't be said of Beijing. So we have here what seems to be a well-timed and significant increase of ties between our two countries, and what appears to be a mutual recognition that this is a very serious, not just a glimmer of hope, but a substantial way forward that very well could guide the democratic world, certainly a world that appreciates what it means to be a democracy and for people to have the ability to express themselves freely. This is a very positive development, and I have to say a major sigh of relief.
Okay. Jonathan, I want to ask you, you know, you were talking to us a little while earlier right now about what this new chapter for the two countries could represent. And I do want to understand from you, when it comes to how domestic critics in India look at the relationship the two countries share, they still flag a few areas. One, of course, is export controls that the United States still has. The US still has significant export controls on India when it comes to the issue of trade. The other is, of course, the question of visas. And I just want to ask you, when we take a long-term look at these two countries' relationships, is that an area you think there might be any change on? I ask you that specifically because we are also 1 year away from an election coming to the US.
Right, I understand. Let me tackle your question about, concerns about technology. The basic fact is that India and Russia have had tremendously close relations for decades. And one would argue at some periods in the history of Delhi, closer than the United States. And certainly today, a lot of the weapons that your military has are Russian made. Right. Thus, we have this very curious and interesting and fundamentally important development in which there's going to be this mutual development of jet engines for military purposes. I mean, that is unprecedented and clearly an effort of the United States to try to impress India into looking at the world beyond just looking at Russia and Moscow as the place to go for arms. India is an emerging country, one of the great powers of the world, and relying on Russian weaponry arguably might be a dubious path moving forward, especially given what we're seeing in Ukraine and what has happened to the Russian military, where the world was watching this and thinking that the Ukraine might be toppled very rapidly, and has held its own, and the fight continues. So this is an interesting thing. The other thing I want to mention in terms of visas, I think there are about 200,000 Indian students attending American universities and colleges. That's a lot of people. And certainly I, in my own experience as a tech entrepreneur, I have Indian developers I work with. The Indians are extremely capable, top-notch developers in technology, and I appreciate and understand it. And I think the United States has gained beautifully by having some of that brain power and commitment in our country, and adding to our technological advances and abilities to compete in the world. And let's face it, we are in a competition between the United States and China when it comes to AI, and there's less talk of India in that space. And I think this is an opportunity to begin trying to evolve certainly India's position in that regard. And I don't see any reason why India wouldn't enter into that sphere in a competitive and one wants it to be responsible AI method and approach. And I think that may be the future.
Okay, I'm actually, Jonathan, going to ask you now almost to give India advice in this next question. One of the big focuses in this visit is the area, as you've already mentioned, of technology. And I want to understand from you, there is this hope of sorts that India can perhaps not displace, it might be too soon to say that, but it could to some degree take up some of the space taken up by China in the global supply chain. And I just want to ask you there, Jonathan, if you had to almost give advice to India, how would you suggest we protect ourselves when it comes to the United States investment in the country? When I mean that, I mean both in terms of protecting our workers, but also protecting our ideas and our industries.